Today, across the country, fire services are organised to serve their local communities as part of a well-structured operation. However, before the outbreak of World War II, the provision of such services was fragmented and lacking in any real cohesion. In fact, before the enactment of the Fire Brigades Act of 1938, which actually came into force in the first month of 1939, fire services operated locally without any legal requirements and controls. Our story starts though in 1937, just a couple of years before the outbreak of war, at a time when many people still believed that the political insurgents in Europe would soon be resolved without the need for any wider conflict. Others, fortunately, had been making contingencies for quite some time. On the world stage in 1937, Amelia Earhart, the pioneering aviator, vanished without trace during a flight in July of that year. Walt Disney introduced Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first animated feature considered to be a masterpiece of its time. The German airship Hindenburg crashed in flames, a horrifying sight captured on camera. And closer to home, idealists from many countries were flocking to Spain to fight in the Civil War. Egypt joined the League of Nations as the 59th member, and Reims Cathedral was reopened following its restoration after the Great War. Here in Britain in 1937, the government's two-year plan to treble the strength of the Royal Air Force was by now completed. The Chancellor, Neville Chamberlain, was warning that the spending on arms was too low, and he said taxes may have to be increased. In April of that year, the aircraft carrier Ark Royal was launched. Later in the year, in November in fact, MPs voted in favour of a plan that called for air raid shelters to be erected in most of Britain's towns and cities. There was some opposition to this proposal by some MPs. However, Winston Churchill told the Commons that air raid shelters were indispensable and that well-organised precautions would mean air attacks on Britain would not be worthwhile. The government introduced the Air Raid Precautions Act. Now, even the optimistic factions could see visible evidence of and an urgency in the preparations for war. In planning for the results of enemy bombing against civilians and businesses, and in considering ways to reduce the risk of vast numbers of casualties in any ensuing conflict. This had a particular impact on the fire service. The Fire Brigades Act placed responsibilities on rural district and borough councils to establish fire brigades with defined standards. There were also many private and estate-operated fire brigades at this time, which continued to operate. In some parts of the country, the police were responsible for the provision of the brigades. Barely then had the reorganisation of the newly formed brigades begun, when the prospect of war in Europe became inevitable. This programme charts the history of the fire service during the war years. One fascinating aspect of this story is the service of 400 volunteer firefighters from Canada who worked alongside the fire brigades in major cities in England. Through the merging of personal stories, original photographs, reenactments and original archive footage, we are able to learn much about the vital contribution made by the men and women of the nation's fire services. This fascinating programme enables us to glimpse those times when ordinary men and women took on overwhelming personal and physical challenges and succeeded in helping to win the war on the home front. This then is the story of the fire service at war.
During the 1930s, the British government was well informed of activities in Germany which indicated that the country might be preparing for war. It was reported that there was an increase in the numbers of civilian flying schools, an expansion of the Labour Corps, and there was widespread introduction of physical training for the population. Other indications too, including preparations to defend the country against aerial bombardment, led some politicians to believe that a real threat now existed. Britain then witnessed the devastation caused by air raids and the subsequent fires during the civil war which raged in Spain during the late 1930s. Meanwhile, Britain's peacetime fire service was fragmented, a mix of local brigades and brigades serving factories and private estates. They were not trained or equipped at the time to cope with major emergencies. Interestingly, in some areas of the country, the police service was responsible for the provision of fire cover.
If we go to the present time, where there is what is called a cadet service, that was non-existent in my day, but you had the opportunity of either becoming what was then called an apprentice fireman in the Portsmouth City Police Fire Brigade, or a shorthand typist in the CID. This meant that you were basically a civilian, but you were working under the auspices of the force, and when you were 20 you were sworn in as a constable. At the end of our service as apprentice firemen, it would be in the region of our 20th birthday, we would then be put on local police classes. There was no question in those days of us going away to a college or anything, a training centre or anything. All the classes were dealt with locally and supervised by senior officers from the Portsmouth force. And we spent about 10 or 12 weeks on those classes, learning police law, doing a certain amount of physical training, and also, incidentally, learning firefighting as well. Well, we were expected to take on most of the duties, with the possible exception of actually running the pumps on the engines. We were never really invited to take part in that sort of activity, but we had lectures and fire drills in the yard of the fire station in what was then Park Road, down by the Guildhall, and we were taught how to roll out lines of hose and how to treat fires from various angles, what to do with chimney fires, hearth fires, major conflagrations, and do what we called sheet jumps from the top of the towers, where you jumped into a sheet and the fellows below hopefully gave you a taut sheet when you landed. There were other forces that did run their fire brigades. We were perhaps unique on the point of view that we also ran the ambulance service, and so you had policemen driving ambulances, and of course every policeman in those days had to qualify as a first aider, so you had policemen driving ambulances with fully qualified as St John ambulance men, and you also had that training to take into the police service. We were all also all members of the Royal Life Saving Society, we all had to get our life saving awards before we were allowed to join the force. If you didn't get those 2 awards, or you failed them for any particular reason, then you were dismissed, and your services were no longer required whilst you were on probation.
With the introduction of the Air Raid Precautions Act and the Fire Brigades Act, the British nation focused on the necessity of planning and preparing for conflict whenever it might come.
In 1938, of course, all fire brigades were amalgamated, and our fire brigade took on a number of AFS to start with. The AFS was being formed then, so our job was to prepare vehicles and prepare the men themselves for the AFS, and that was what my prime job was, because prior to that I had a commission in the cadet force, so I did a fair bit of military training and that kind of thing, and we used this to start training the auxiliary fire service. And I suppose for a year I did nothing else but training auxiliary fire service, you see, in training in ladder drill, pump drill, all sorts of things that one needed to do. Quite a good job, actually.
Building air raid shelters was parallel to the urgent galvanisation and expansion of the country's 1,400 peacetime fire brigades. Loudspeaker vans toured towns and cities as part of the campaign to attract recruits. Every public house and factory was a source of recruitment too. Journals wrote again and again about the need for men and women to join the fire service. The auxiliary fire service, all citizen volunteers, was to be a self-contained organisation which would work with the regular service.
Well, we had the factory door open at work and at Testwood, and a young chap I knew said he'd join the fire service, and would I come along and join? So I said, well, he said, you could put your age on a couple of years. That would have made me 17, but I went along with him, and when I saw the officer, he looked at me and he said, you're a big chap, he said, you could put your age on and become a fireman, not a messenger or anything like that. So I put my age on, and I walked in the station at sort of 15 and came out at 19. And I said, when do I start? What do I do? He said, can you come back later tonight? I said, well, this was 7:30. I haven't had my tea yet. So I went home and had some tea and come back. And he said, I'll fix you up with some gear. So I always remember this. So we went up in the loft in the station, and they had a big box of old fire service stuff, AFS stuff and all sorts. And he said, oh, try these tunics on. And he found a tunic which it would fit me. It was a single-breasted fire tunic. There was only a few of these made. And so I had a single-breasted, and he fixed me up with a belt and axe and some clothes. And I was away on service then. So at that time we were doing 2 nights on and 3 nights off. Now, it seemed we used to get quite a number of siren calls and a terrific amount of ACAC firing in those days. And at that time I lived with my parents at Little Testwood, and I used to cycle with my helmet on and all my gear over to Millbrook, sometimes once and twice during the night. But then we came up with an idea in the end that we would only do it once. If we went back the second time, we would stay there just sleep on the floor in the kitchen all night, because people must realise that we had to do a full-time job daytime. So we had to be away from the station by 7 in the morning, to be at work by 7:30, to do another 12-hour day on aircraft, continuous, 7 days a week.
In major cities, including London, all of which were potential prime targets in any war from the air, recruitment and training were the highest priorities. In the provinces, however, training and equipment did, with few exceptions, fall some way behind the city areas.
One of the things we found about the early days of then was that every town had its own ideas. So they had different hose couplings, and we found that our hose wouldn't fit Southampton, for instance, and when you went to London, our standpipes wouldn't fit the London standpipes, and things like that.
On September the 1st, 1939, the order for action stations was given by radio broadcast and by telephone to the men and women of the Auxiliary Fire Service. From many factories, offices, shops and farms, they rushed to their designated stations. Winston Churchill, speaking in the House of Commons, was to say, "As I see it, we must so arrange that when any district is smitten by bombs, which are flung about at utter random, strong mobile forces will descend on the scene in power and mercy to conquer the flames. We have to make a job of this business of living and working under fire. Long, dark months of trials and tribulations lie before us. Death and sorrow will be the companions of our journey, constancy and valor our only shield. We must be united. We must be undaunted. Our qualities and deeds must burn and glow through the gloom of Europe until they become the veritable beacon of its salvation."
Well, one thing that did stick in my mind was there were people conscripted into the fire service, and they were nervous, and this was a bad thing. I think it was a very bad thing, because you know, as soon as the siren blew, they were away to the toilet, and they were really bad, and they would vomit, they would it would really, yeah, they would still hang on with you, but you know, but the spirit, the team spirit was quite high amongst the men. There was a little bit of messing about and acting the fool, but you'll never stop that. But this was all a morale booster.
From the day of mobilization until the first air raids in 1940, the AFS was able to train and equip to a much higher standard than had been achieved in the erratic months before the war. However, they were criticized by many members of the public for not being in the armed services. Unfortunately, the fire service was considered by some to be a place for draft dodgers. It was only when the AFS and later the NFS demonstrated courage, skill and heroism during the enemy raids on English towns and cities that they won the hearts of a grateful nation.
I remember standing in or working in Queen Victoria Street when he dropped a series of bombs down the street, and he blew the whole lot of buildings down the street, and it's quite a famous picture actually, of the buildings falling down all together right the way down the street, giving a hell of a smash. And there was 14 fire engines involved in that. Now, I didn't know how many men were involved. We were lucky, we got away with it, and so did my machine, but we lost a lot of men and a lot of machines without a doubt. That was a nasty, nasty incident.
When the first firebombs fell on the city, I had not been called up and was still working in an insurance company. Catching the last workman's train from St James's Street station, it was still dark, but the glow from the fires lit up the sky. On arriving, the air was thick with acrid smoke and still hot from the intense heat. I made my way up Eldon Street, past the fire engines and over the hoses. The firefighters looked grey with fatigue and red-eyed from the effects of the smoke. Apart from great devastation, some horses in the Whitbread stables were trapped and burnt to death. After that terrible time, static water tanks and dam units were placed in the streets to help with the supply and previous problems with burst mains and no pressure. The firemen and women did a wonderful job and saved our city and many others from complete obliteration.
An anonymous eyewitness wrote, "The first row of warehouses was burning from one end to the other. I walked down between the two warehouses, and about halfway down there was a staff car parked in the middle, and standing casually by it was a young firewoman. She seemed not to be taking any notice of the situation all around her. I walked past as though I was used to walking out every Saturday afternoon in the middle of falling bombs. We gave each other a smile, and I carried on. Heavy raids, especially during the early years of the war, killed and injured many firemen and women. After their baptism of fire, Winston Churchill said of those who served that they were heroes with grimy faces.
I travelled all over the place in the Blitz, on London, Birmingham, Coventry, Bristol, Exeter, Plymouth, Portsmouth and Southampton. A fair run round, you know. But I didn't spend very much time at home then. Was for about nearly a year, I suppose, because the London Blitz, everybody said about the London Blitz, but it didn't last that long, you know. I think about 2 months, and the Germans shifted their ability, as it were, to towns, not London. They shifted to Coventry, and they bashed Coventry and Birmingham, and places like that, you know. And then, as I say, if you were travelling, we went to Coventry on a number of occasions, and the brigade was so disorganised, the country was so disorganised that the German bombers were being directed by Ray, so it was thought. And on this occasion, obviously they got the Rays mixed up because we got called to Birmingham and the fire was in Coventry, and we passed on the road. All the Birmingham people were going to Coventry and we were going to go to Birmingham because the Rays had not mixed, and we got sent to the wrong place. And we got that 2 nights running actually. We went to Coventry and they went to Birmingham and the other way round. Not very severe by comparison. They talked a lot about Coventry being Coventry and that kind of thing. Compared with Bristol or Plymouth, I don't think Coventry was so bad. We went to Bristol and then on to Exeter, then on to Plymouth, and Plymouth was very badly hit. I can remember looking down in Devonport. I don't know if you know Devonport at all, but I remember looking down the hill into Devonport and not a building standing. The whole thing was flat. There wasn't a building above single room height. Terrible, really. Everything on fire. Very little firefighting being done. People streaming out of the place. You talk about refugees. All the people of Plymouth streaming out of the place up the road to get into the hills before dark, so they didn't get bombed again. They had a very bad time.
In addition to the need for firefighters, there was an ongoing demand for dispatch riders, messengers, drivers and control room operators. It wasn't just during raids that everyone pulled together. At mealtimes too, help was always welcome. Mary Belbin recalls,
It's when the ration was on and you had a job to cut out the little joint of meat you had, and I used to ask her to cut that for me because we had someone come down from headquarters and we didn't know that. And of course I cooked the dinner ordinary, and of course these big bugs were down there and they had the dinner that we didn't know anything about, and they commended me on that. I said what a lovely meal it was. But those men, if there was any left over, I used to put it on the hatch. They used to run down the thing to get it, if I made a nice pudding or anything like that.
Within just 2 years from its mobilization in September 1939, and despite many operational problems and other difficulties, Britain's peacetime fire service had faced the challenges thrust upon it by war. The peacetime strength of some 50,000 personnel had expanded in the new civil defence role from 200,000 at the outbreak of war to about 300,000 by the spring of 1941. The corps strength comprised regulars, volunteers, part-timers, and members of the auxiliary fire service. In addition, there were local stirrup parties and various supplementary firefighting groups. However, there was a need for more help. Autumn 1940 saw the London Blitz and the Battle of Britain. Then a brief lull until mid-1941, when significant attacks took place on several major cities as well as London. The fire service had now been nationalised. A renewed call for assistance went out from the British government, and further consideration was given to the formation of a Canadian firefighting unit to serve in the United Kingdom. On the 24th of June 1942, the first contingent of volunteers arrived from Canada, and after training and familiarization, units were posted to major cities including London, Bristol and Portsmouth. The Canadian volunteers served until the end of the war. They saw service during the continuation of the Blitz and were involved in various activities in support of the preparations for the D-Day landings. The story of the Corps of Canadian Firefighters and their significant contribution is relatively unknown. Until now. Canadian firefighters were keen to support their English colleagues in early 1940. A leading advocate was Lieutenant Colonel Lister, then Chief of the Fire Service in British Columbia. Similar proposals had originated from, among other places, Ontario and Manitoba. In London, severe enemy air raids mounted on the 29th and 30th of December 1940 indicated that there would be no let-up in the raids foreseeable into 1941. The British authorities were prompted to reconsider the support offered by the Canadians. The Home Office included in the terms given for any assistance that the Canadians were, for politically inspired reasons, to be regarded as civilians and as volunteers. Up to 1,000 trained firemen would be welcome. One of the unwritten agreements was that the Canadians would help to boost the morale of both firefighters and the British population alike. They would be regarded as a valuable resource and as brothers in arms, standing shoulder to shoulder at a time of need. Active recruiting did not, however, begin until March 11, 1942. Following selection and training, the first volunteers embarked for England. They docked 9 days later. It was summer 1942. The official welcome ceremony took place in London on the 30th of June, with Home Secretary Herbert Morrison attending on behalf of the British government. Herbert Morrison in his welcome said, "Now you come to add a new kind of contribution to the common effort. You come to play your part in our blitzed cities, in the hazards and struggles in our fighting home front. When the day of trial comes again, as none of us forget that it may come with little warning, you will be here to meet and defeat its terrors." A total of 406 men, 8 firefighting groups, arrived between June and December 1942.
My experience with they had different uniform, And one thing we wanted to do when we joined with them first, we wanted to try their uniform on. We wanted to try their thigh boots on, because they wore thigh boots and a 3/4 neck.
Jack Coulter served with the Corps of Canadian Firefighters. During his time in the Corps, he became a leading firefighter.
We arrived at Liverpool and immediately were put on a train for Southampton. Our destination was at Testwood, just outside of Southampton, in a school with grounds converted into a training facility for the National Fire Service. We spent about 3 weeks there, becoming accustomed to the trailer pumps and rolling out hose one length at a time, instead of laying out the hose from the back of the hose wagon or pump as we were used to. On completion of training, we were transferred into Southampton at the Alliance Hotel, just 1 block from the docks. Because of our desire to get into action, we were often called upon to travel to other locations where bombs had fallen.
The groups were dispersed according to perceived need as soon as training was complete. Corps headquarters was in Wimbledon, South London, and detachments were sent to Plymouth, Bristol, Southampton and Portsmouth. Mary Belbin recalls,
The Canadians came out, I forget how many there was, quite a few, and they used to tell us about their families and things like that, and they used to go on manoeuvres, and some of them one day, one fell off the engine and he was killed. And when they put his coffin in the hall and with a flag over, and we went then to see it. We had field days, and I used to dress up for that, dress in my uniform for that, and I went down on the field day and served teas from the mobile canteen.
off duty, the Canadians excelled at team competitions.
What we did is we had a tow vehicle and a trailer pump, and we would drive forward to a tank, and the idea was to disconnect the pump, then hook it up, put the suction in the water, lay the hose out, and knock down a target. So this was fairly standard type of a competition. We Canadians, probably a little younger and maybe a little more active than the British, were able to compete well enough to be the winners of the competition, and as a result we were presented with this trophy.
The other very thing that struck us, that the strength of these men, they were very strong against us. You know, they could pick up a light pump off of its trolley, off the trailer, and they could pick it up in their arms and carry it, you know, which there's handles on the end for the British firemen, it was too. Also, another thing that struck me, the way they handled fire gear, they threw it. They could, when they run out hose, they never carry the branch under their arm as we were. They threw it and they catch it like baseball fashion. They just sling it. They catch them every time. Very good. Some competition training with them because they were bored, but they done their competition training the different than we were trained. They went from get to work to make up and come over a line. You know, they completed the operation. It wasn't a matter of knock a target down, it was all over. It was to collect their gear up. And I remember on one occasion, one of the Canadians went to get in the back of the ATV to pull away, and he missed, and he knocked himself out. You know, he knocked himself completely out. We had a casualty on our hands. 42, and I first met them when we'd moved the Totton Fire Station. We closed the Totton Fire Station and moved to Testwood, and we went up to there because we used to draw some of our fuel from there. We used to draw some of our fuel from there. If we didn't draw it from there, we had a garage pump we took over at Little Testwood. We used to go there with the Canadians and get fuel from there as well. They kept their machines. They had Dennis trailer pumps and camouflage nets because the machines were all scattered around the outside of the Testwood Park and covered over with camouflage nets. They had to be netted every night so they wouldn't be found from the air.
Although by this time air attacks on Britain had begun to diminish, the Canadians saw service during calls to both major incidents and lull period incidents. The detachment in Portsmouth, for example, distinguished themselves during severe raids on the city on the 15th and 16th of August 1943.
The Canadian government donated hundreds and hundreds of thousands of feet of hose, rubber lined hose, which we used to call Canadian hose, and that was shipped to England, and we used to put couplings on it and equip all the brigades for miles around. And that was a job which took a long time and employed a lot of people. But one of the best things that the Fire Brigade ever did was to amalgamate and standardise their equipment.
In addition to their usual duties, the detachment in Southampton contributed to trials associated with the secret Pluto project in the Solent. During their service on Britain's home front, the Canadians suffered 5 casualties and 3 deaths. Following an agreement between the Canadian and British governments, the Corps returned home in small groups between December 1944 and August 1945. The Wimbledon headquarters closed on July the 31st, 1945. Upon departure, the Corps donated a large amount of firefighting clothing to the National Fire Service. Jack Coulter wrote,
The last summer after the invasion in June, it was difficult to wait for news of what was happening on the continent. A few of us had volunteered for service as Army firefighters, but it became clear that we would not be needed. We eventually left Southampton before Christmas and spent New Year's Eve in Liverpool before embarking for home on the Mauretania.
Canada subsequently embodied the experience gained by the Corps to help shape the provision of its peacetime fire service. A British wartime firefighter is recorded as saying, "I have the greatest admiration for the Corps of Canadian firefighters. These men volunteered to leave the security and comfort of their homeland, face a perilous journey across the U-boat-infested ocean, and if they survived that journey, then faced an unknown period of danger, discomfort, short rations, uncomfortable living conditions, and the possibility of becoming another entry in the civilian war dead register. Gentlemen, I salute you." resourcefulness in time of war becomes second nature. Vehicles of all types, including taxicabs, were pressed into service and provided support to the standard issue Dennis, Ford and Austin appliances. Trailer pumps were used extensively and successfully. Water storage tanks placed at strategic sites helped to overcome the problems caused by damage to water mains after an air raid. Working with the rescue crews and other members of the civil defence, the fire service was able to perfect new, more effective techniques for use in emergencies. Ambulance drivers, as part of the nation's emergency network, made a vital contribution.
My father was quite on my side because he was keen for me to go into the services, and in the end I managed to get an interview with the Red Cross and was accepted. And because I was in a reserved occupation, I had to have what they then knew as a green card. And he managed to, I don't know how he managed to do it, but he managed to get me a green card, which enabled me to be mobilised with the Red Cross. Because I had only driven the family car at that stage, although I'd driven it for some years, I had to have a reference to say that I was able to drive something heavier than that, as I was hoping to drive ambulances. So my father arranged with the local corn chandler that I drove their 1,500 weight truck on the rounds, delivering corn and so forth round to the local farms, and I was able to then get a reference. My father had a friend who ran a garage, and he took me on a driving test and gave me a reference that I was fit to drive something bigger than the family car. I then went to London for an interview and a driving test, which was taken round Grosvenor Square. Now, I had never driven anything in traffic, anything like London traffic, and of course in those days there was quite a lot of it about. And we had a driving test round Grosvenor Square, and the first thing they did was to put us in a left-hand drive Dodge ambulance, which I had never seen a left-hand drive car before, or vehicle of any sort. And the more sophisticated of us, there were about a dozen, I suppose, at that time, being interviewed, and the more sophisticated threw their hands up and said they couldn't possibly drive a left-hand drive car or vehicle of any sort. And then us from the country, the country bumpkins, were too frightened to say anything, so we got in and made the best job we could of it. And strangely enough, those that had protested didn't pass, and we who had made an effort, the driving instructor, or the man who was interviewing us, he said, well, you have to drive lease-lend ambulances, and if you can't drive a left-hand drive vehicle, you're no use to us. So we were the lucky ones and managed to scrape through, and though we were accepted. I'd never been so far away from home before, and one of my most vivid recollections was that we stopped at Crewe, and I was frightened to death and starving, and a sailor shared his sandwiches with me, which I thought was jolly civil of him. But finally I got to Chester, and that was a very nice posting because we were a mixed unit. we had South African girls and also American. The American girls wore khaki uniform, but the South African girls were very popular because, like us, they wore navy uniform. And our issue stockings were gunmetal grey lisle stockings, which were pretty unbecoming, but our friends in the South African detachments dished us out with black silk stockings, which cheered us up no end in a rather gloomy sort of situation.
Over many weeks, there was a gradual and consistent build-up of ships and other waterborne craft in the Solent, along the south coast, and in every river and shallow creek. The risk of fire within this vast armada was recognised from the outset, and to protect the ships here and in the homeland ports, a fireboat service was established in collaboration with the naval authorities. The central fireboat control for the Portsmouth area, which is where the main invasion force was assembling, was in Highlands Road, Fareham. Depending on their capability, fireboats were categorised into seagoing, moderate weather and inland. Before D-Day, the fireboats were well equipped, the crews were well trained, and they were ready for all emergencies. Morale amongst the crews was always high, although they were frustrated that they could not sail out with the invasion forces. But their role remained vital because they helped many ships crippled by enemy action to return to safe waters. Between May and August 1944, the fireboats in the Portsmouth Naval Command area attended 90 special service calls in addition to fire calls. The fireboat crews carried out their vigil to the end and played their full part in the invasion of Europe.
I got put onto a mobile column again, and we had each officer had a company. I had 10 pumps, petrol tanker and water carrier, and we moved about in 10 pumps as a convoy. And we came down here to Southampton a couple of times, and we travelled all over the place. And one interesting thing was that on all the country roads right down through the country, you would come across this concrete slab in the middle of inside the road, and we didn't know what these were for. And when the time came, we got an order saying, take your company, old Mulwich St George's company, take your company to so-and-so, gave us a map reference, and you'll receive your order from there. When we got there, a dispatch order saying, look, there's concrete slabs down the road, so put a pump on each concrete slab and stay there for 2 hours. Don't move at all for 2 hours. In the meantime, we did that all right. We hadn't been there for many seconds before the army came down through there. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of the army moved from north to south. And we were to protect the convoy in the event of lorries or anything catching fire, push them off the road, put them out and let the others go on. And we did have a couple of ammunition lorries, which caused a bit of fun. But nothing really serious, you know. And that was it. Then it went on the night of the invasion. This was the most terrible thing I've ever seen, I think. The sky was full of airplanes. I can remember it now, full of airplanes, literally. And we got the orders to move, and we came to Maidenhead, then on to Reading, then on to Aldershot, then on to Alresford, and then eventually on to Southampton. And we got posted to Southampton docks, my company, and we pulled up alongside the docks, and we had to put a pump every so often along the edge of the docks. And the Americans were loading petrol from big stacks, great big stacks of petrol onto ships, and these ships were going off from the invasion. And we stopped there all night, watching these, nothing untoward occurred, and come daybreak, not a ship to be seen. Not a ship to be seen, never seen anything like it. They were so wonderfully organised, all these ships got loaded and off they went, and they were gone out to the water, nothing alongside the docks at all. And the next morning about 10 o'clock, I suppose, we got one to return home, and we came back home again. And that was our final war effort, was the in Southampton docks,
for a civil defence and firefighting capability in reoccupied territories for the protection of captured ports and cities. The British Army had been resisting such a move. However, by February 1943, they finally agreed in principle to the formation of the overseas contingent. The fire service provided 2,800 men, 500 women, 560 appliances and 4 fireboats. During the following year, the Colour Scheme, as it was called, was introduced to provide fire protection to the massive D-Day build-up of military stores and materials. The level of cover was maintained until November 1944, when the progress of the war dictated that the Colour Scheme be phased out and personnel returned to their respective fire forces.
In a changing world, we must never forget the dedication and sacrifice of previous generations and the human spirit that persists even against the most overwhelming odds.